My name is Dr. Leon McDougall, the 121st President of the National Medical Association. Welcome to the National Medical Association Professional Development Series with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Our presentation today is entitled Increasing Diversity in Clinical Trials for Better Health Outcomes. It is my distinct honor to introduce our moderator, Dr. Doris Brown, who was the 118th president of the National Medical Association and president and CEO of Brown and Associates, a health consulting company that manages programs addressing national and global health disparities. In addition, she is a military veteran and retired as a colonel in the United States Army Medical Corps, where she served as director for the Medical Research and Development at the U.S. Army Medical Research and Material Command. Let's welcome Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Dr. McDougall, and welcome to the National Medical Association Eli Lilly and Bio panel presentation. We have planned a very lively and informative discussion on the need to increase diversity in clinical trials as we share the work being done right now by industry to increase diversity in clinical trials, as well as how we can work together to create more equitable and innovative treatment modalities leading to better overall health outcomes. I just would like to give you a few pointers in terms of how our program will run this afternoon. We will not have questions until all the panelists have completed their presentation. I will only provide a brief introductory remarks for each of the presenters, as well as their bios will be shown on the screen while I'm introducing them and can also be found on the National Medical Association website. I have a very stellar panel of experts with me. And to start our program, we are graced with Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who will provide an overview of Senate-sponsored legislation S4262, COVID-19 Health Disparities Action Act, and support for diversity in clinical trials. To give you a little bit of information about Senator Menendez, his story is really a quintessential American story. He grew up the son of Cuban immigrants in a tenement building in Union City and has risen to become one of 100 United States senators. He served as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 113th Congress. That committee is one of the oldest and most revered committees in the Senate at a time when world affairs has a dramatic effect on our economy at home. He has earned a national reputation for his international leadership in the Senate, which pairs with his long-term reputation as a fighter for New Jersey families who put their economic security ahead of powerful special interests. Senator Menendez's career has been a tribute to his desire to protect the powerless from the powerful and ensure fairness for every American. He has been widely recognized for his leadership on promoting safe and healthy families. He has championed legislation to support mothers suffering from postpartum depression, help families meet the challenges of autism, and keep young athletes safe from harm on the playing field. He serves on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee and has championed increased consumer protection and corporate accountability, fairness in lending, affordable housing, and comprehensive approaches to community revitalization. He served as chairman of the Banking Subcommittee on Housing, Transportation, and Community Development, where he fought for smart growth, jobs for the 21st century, and updating our very needed aging transportation system. As a member of the Finance Committee, he has sponsored legislation increasing access to health care, advocated for fairness in the tax code to help middle-class families get college education and be able to retire. And Senator Menendez has pushed for trade initiatives to ensure America's global competitiveness. Welcome, Senator Menendez.
Thank you for inviting me here to speak with you today about an issue we all care about, ensuring that our clinical trials reflect the diversity of our nation so that the latest breakthroughs truly benefit all Americans. This is an issue close to my heart and something I've been working on for some time through conversations with various stakeholders. Earlier this year, I led the charge in asking companies engaged in COVID-19 product development, from vaccines to treatments and everything in between, what they were going to do to address the ongoing lack of clinical trial disparity. The answers were varied, and what became clear to me is that we must all continue these conversations and work long after COVID-19 waves. As you all know too well, we're facing the worst pandemic in 100 years, and our minority communities have been hit especially hard. African Americans and Hispanics have suffered from higher rates of COVID-19, and compounding the tragedies is the economic pain inflicted on our communities. This pandemic is a multi-front battle. Even with the billions of dollars in aids we passed earlier this year to help our hospitals, the unemployed, and small businesses, it's clear that much more must be done. And until we have a safe and effective vaccine for the novel coronavirus, we will not achieve a complete and lasting economic recovery. That's why it's so important that we ensure the participation of minorities in clinical trials. Indeed, earlier this month, CBS reported that the nation's first phase 3 trial for a coronavirus vaccine failed to attract a significant number of Black, Brown, and Indigenous participants. That's unacceptable. We know we can do better. Over the years, we've made great strides in involving participation by women in clinical trials, but minority participation continues to lag. There are many reasons for this, from justified historical mistrust to the lack of minority clinicians enrolled in trial programs. But with COVID-19 posing a disproportionate threat to our Black and Brown communities, the need for racial diversity in clinical trials has never mattered more. We need bold action to ensure minority participation and access to all diagnostic tests, treatments, and potential vaccines. I have hope. I see it in the work of my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, who have always been at the forefront of fighting for justice for all people. Likewise, I see it in the tireless work of advocates, providers, and the communities themselves, determined to meet today's unprecedented challenges. We must be bold, we must be creative, and we must use this opportunity to break down barriers to minority participation in clinical trials and ensure that tomorrow's breakthroughs are shared by all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Menendez, for those enlightening remarks. As a medical oncologist and past president of the National Medical Association, I have been involved in all aspects of clinical research, including serving as a participant in a few clinical trials. I clearly understand the need for diverse involvement, but also appreciate the limitations, barriers, and urgency for all of us to be aware of the upsides as well as the downside of participation in clinical trials. So let me begin by providing you with an overview of the National Medical Association's Project Impact. Impact stands for Increasing Minority Participation and Awareness on Clinical Trials. This was a project chartered to identify ways to increase minority physicians and patients' involvement in clinical trials. It was created in 1999 to train those minority physician investigators and patient consumers on the importance of equitable participation in clinical research. And over the past 21 years, the National Medical Association has provided various levels of education and intensive training to over 5,000 health professionals in the United States and the Caribbean. Key aspects of the project was to conduct its signature good clinical practice and skills building training program to ensure compliance with specific regulations and guidelines that governs all human research. This was a 2-day good clinical practice program that featured clinical research experts from government, academia, industry, and private practice. Project Impact strongly encouraged greater participation of African Americans in all aspects of biomedical research and clinical trials, including supporting African American physicians in becoming eligible to serve as principal investigators and fully participate in the clinical research process. We know that African American patients and physician representation in clinical trials happens to be inadequate, which compromises certainly the quality and the validity of clinical trials findings that are going to be used to manage those patients in the future. Notwithstanding the atrocities that have happened to African Americans by studies that we all know very well, ranging from Tuskegee on up through other areas, we are still very much committed in protecting our patients and increasing physician as well as consumer diversity and participation in all aspects of the clinical process. Building on this strong educational foundation, in conjunction with housing the largest minority physician database and a reputation of being an advocate for minority health, as well as a trusted resource in our community, the NMA will continue to chip away at health disparities and inequities while building an army, because I come from the military, of trained clinical investigators. Project Impact is a remarkable achievement on which the NMA continues to build, as it is crucial today for not only physicians and other people of color to be interested in and to participate in conducting clinical trials. We must continue to empower our patients to recognize the role that they must play in order to secure precision medicine and a healthier future for themselves, their families, and those who follow them. Every physician who enjoys the trust of patients should recognize their role as an important resource for those patients in their decision regarding appropriate clinical trial participation as needed to achieve health equity. Now, I would like to introduce our first excellent expert presenter, that is Dr. Timothy Garnett. He is the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President at Lilly Research Laboratories, where he manages medical affairs, medical strategy and development, among many other responsibilities at the Eli Lilly and Company. He comes with many years of experience. His clinical training and practice is in obstetrics and gynecology. He will highlight how Lilly is doing at the forefront of diversifying clinical trials as he discusses Lilly's clinical trial and the steps they are taking to increase minority participation, as well as how industry overall is working to support diversity in clinical trials, and not just for COVID-19, but to promote equity in the entire healthcare system. Good afternoon, Dr. Garnett.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and also thanks to Dr. McDougall and Senator Menendez. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon on this Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and NMA panel. It's certainly been a tumultuous year for all of us with the advent of COVID-19, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter and its focus on social justice. And of course, we still have an election to come. But I think these events are a great way of driving change. And an area where I think we desperately need change is in representation of clinical trial of African Americans and other minorities in our clinical trials. COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting African American and other minority communities to a frightening extent. African Americans are three times more likely to be diagnosed with COVID-19, 5 times more likely to be hospitalized. In addition, the Black Lives Matter movement has, I think, shone a light on many elements of social inequity, but specifically access to healthcare. And so this has created a burning platform that I think we should take advantage of and use to finally drive change in this important area of how we can improve the recruitment into our clinical trials of African Americans and other minorities. And it really is the intersection of Black Lives Matter and COVID-19. This is not just an issue of fairness and justice, important though that is. It's also an issue of science. We know that there are some medicines that work better or do not work as well in some minority communities. We've identified that on occasion, but one has to wonder how many other medicines are out there where this element of their efficacy or safety has never been fully or adequately studied. So hopefully by ensuring that we have appropriate representation in our clinical trials, we can answer these scientific questions, as well as addressing the obvious racial, the obvious fairness and justice elements of ensuring that our clinical trials represent the communities who will receive our medicines. And really it is as simple as that. Our clinical trials need to be representative of those who are going to take our medicines. This is not a new issue. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 30 years now, and it's a topic that we've discussed intermittently over the years, but we've never managed to address in a consistent and a sustained manner. Now, at Lilly, we have made progress. 5 years ago, minority populations in the United States were only about 20% of our clinical trials. And due to the efforts we put in and some of the work we've done with the NMA, we've managed to increase that to 30%. But of course, the overall representation of minorities in the US is nearer 40%, so we still have some way to go. Having said that, in some of our therapeutic areas, we should feel very proud. For example, in our diabetes studies, they are fully representative and very accurately represent the populations who receive our medicines. But in other therapeutic areas, they don't, particularly in oncology, where the recruitment of African Americans into clinical trials in oncology is woefully low, certainly in the studies that we are performing. So although we've made progress, and we should feel proud of that progress, I think we still have some way to go. I believe that we have an opportunity here, not just as a company, but as an industry, and working across industry with other partners such as the NMA, to finally make a change here. The time is right and the door is open, and the opportunity is there for us to once and for all ensure that our clinical trials are representative of the population in the United States. So how are we going to do this? Well, there are really 5 themes that I'll talk through quickly, and we can talk about more in the Q&A. Firstly, investigators, and Dr. Brown talked about this already. It's essential that we have investigators in our clinical trials who are from the minority communities that we want to recruit patients from. And we know that the representation of African Americans and Latinx physicians is particularly low in our clinical trials. Asian physicians are better represented, but African American representation is low. Due to the efforts of Project Impact and working with the NMA, we have made progress, and that cadre of physicians is emerging and developing. But still, we need to make sure that our investigators are also parts of the community from which we want to draw patients. Secondly, and related to that, we need to run our studies where the patients are. This sounds obvious, but actually, pharmaceutical companies tend to go to the same cities and the same investigators over and over again. And something we learned with our COVID experience is that we had to change our thinking and make sure that we were running studies where the patients were and where the disease was rife in cities like Detroit and Houston across the country. So in our COVID studies, we have very actively ensured that we've had centers where the epicenter of the pandemic has been taking place. And obviously that's been moving throughout the country with time. But in that way, we've managed to ensure that in some populations, we are fully representing the populations who have COVID. For example, the Latinx population is well represented in our COVID clinical trials, but less so for the African American population. So still work to be done there. Thirdly, we need to acknowledge the mistakes of the past. And this was mentioned previously. Events such as Tuskegee and the Henrietta Lacks experiments have left a scar that I think is difficult to eradicate. And we have to own that and acknowledge not only the impact that that had on communities, but also talk about what we are doing to address those concerns. One of the things that we're doing at Lilly, embarking on, is the African American clinical trial journey, trying to understand what is it that leads African Americans to choose or not choose to participate in clinical trials, whether it's access to healthcare, the relationship they have with their physician, the cost associated with the clinical trial, and understand what are those decision points that cause people to either participate or not participate. But again, we have an opportunity here because rarely have we talked more about clinical trials in this country than we have at the moment. There are so many patients currently enrolling in vaccine studies. Lilly is not a vaccine company, but many of our fellow companies are. That we've never read so much about clinical trials that we have now. So let's use that as an opportunity to educate people, but also explain what we have done to address some of the concerns of the past. Fourthly, we need to make our clinical trials easier to participate in, whether that's virtual visits so that people don't need to go to the traditional clinical trial investigator site. Maybe they can have their visits at home through Zoom, like this call now, or they can go to the local CVS or Walgreens or other pharmacy and have their visits there where they are in their community. We need to collect less data and we need to make the inclusion criteria easier to participate in. We set many barriers for some of our clinical trials. We need to make sure that people can get to those sites where they're having the clinical trials are being run. So help with transport, help with the costs associated of being within a clinical trial, and do that in a more systematic way. And then the final point, my fifth point, is we need to start measuring and setting targets. You know, if you're not keeping score, you're just practicing, as the old adage goes. And I think we as a company and as an industry have to set clear and publicly accountable targets to ensure that we're making improvements with the aim of ultimately ensuring that our clinical trials fully represent the communities that we serve. Having said all of this, I think at Lilly and in other pharma companies I know, we're on this journey. I've never known or heard so much interest, excitement, and engagement on this topic as I have over the last 3 or 4 months. And I believe that the coming together of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement has created a unique opportunity here for us to make a lasting difference in an area where we have made progress, but we really need to make sure that we have a sustained and consistent approach across our companies and across the industry. I'll stop there, Dr. Brown, and let's carry on with the next speaker.
Thank you, Tim. Our next presenter is Dr. Carter Esham, the Executive Vice President for Emerging Companies at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, that's BIO, B-I-O. In her role as the Executive VP, she manages and directs BIO's policy development, advocacy, research, and educational initiative for emerging companies that are part of BIO, which really composes about 90% of BIO's membership. Dr. Esham received her PhD in microbiology from the University of Georgia, and she comes with many years of experience in a variety of areas, including environmental, education, science, technology, and healthcare related issues. Her presentation is entitled Diversity in Clinical Trials. She will discuss what BIO is doing to improve diversity in clinical trials. Dr. Esham.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and I'll echo Dr. Garnett's comments. I'd first like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be participating in this very important discussion. As mentioned, BIO is the world's largest trade association representing biotechnology companies. And as mentioned, our membership includes most of the large biopharmaceutical companies, but the vast majority of our members are pre-revenue small companies, which are actually responsible for a majority of the treatments and therapies in the clinical pipeline. All are working to deliver the next generation of biomedical breakthroughs. I'd like to share with you all a recent announcement by our new CEO, Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, where she outlined a vision for a new bioequity agenda. This initiative aims to attack the systemic inequality, injustice, and unfair treatment of women and communities of color through the positive force of biotechnology. BIO is challenging the industry and its partners to find solutions for an equitable healthcare delivery, disparate economic development, and nutritional and environmental disparities in the United States and around the globe. And we look forward to coming back with you to discuss the details of this agenda. One of the action items of this initiative underway is to improve education about and increase participation in clinical trials by underrepresented communities. As discussed, the need and opportunity for change has never been more clear as we work towards developing and providing vaccines and treatments to those afflicted by the COVID-19 virus. Out of necessity, unique collaborations have been forged. Use of technology for data capture, telemedicine, and evidence generation have been deployed. Looking forward, we must commit to capturing the lessons learned and work to implement changes that prove to be more patient-centric, enable more participation by diverse communities, and provide a greater understanding of biological and social determinants of health for patients from underrepresented communities, genders, and ages, and ultimately work to create a more effective and informative ecosystem. Creating a new way to conduct clinical development, of course, can't be done in a vacuum. Bio and biotech companies need to work together with key stakeholders to understand lessons learned from their perspectives. That's going to be key to effectuating real change. For BIO, for example, BIO provided a survey tool for patient organizations to capture lessons learned from their perspectives, and the results of that survey will be available this fall. Regarding our plan to improve diversity in clinical trials, we'll be focused on 1, education and committed engagement. We have to work together with community, faith-based, and patient organizations, as well as medical professionals who are charged with the care of underrepresented communities, and assess what educational materials exist, what additional information is needed, and partner conducting continuous and comprehensive dissemination of this information. We need to collaborate on and determine the best means to provide general information about clinical trials and specific information about opportunities to participate in trials. We've supported efforts such as done by the National Black Church Initiative, which provides information about clinical trials to its congregations across the United States. And we're interested in working with all organizations that have activities underway and utilize our abilities to get the word out. We're also interested in hearing from you and key stakeholders about what operational or policy barriers exist so we can work to remove them. Second, we're going to work to develop and disseminate tools and best practices to our member companies so they can develop internal and external strategies and operations designed to increase representation from diverse patient populations. These tools need to be comprehensive and begin at the earliest stage of clinical development, starting with how to approach recruitment and enrollment, and carry all the way through to how to evaluate outcomes and conduct lifecycle management of approved medicines. We're currently working with scientific and professional organizations that have or are currently developing such tools, and will be providing educational opportunities to our member companies in the near future. We'll be working with our member companies that have been developing vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 to understand where and how they were successful in achieving greater diversity and what hurdles they encountered, so we can develop policies and work streams that advance what went well and resolve issues that arose. Third, we're going to be looking to expand the clinical development enterprise, which has been mentioned a couple of times on this, during this panel already. And that is to encourage and enable participation of more physicians that are at the primary point of care for underrepresented communities. As we are observing the use of decentralized clinical trial approaches, use of telemedicine and digital technologies, we have the opportunity to identify practices we should carry forward that have proved to be more inclusive and are equally or more effective. We're interested in hearing from physicians and physician organizations, again, to hear their perspectives and find ways to collaborate and develop strategies to create a more inclusive clinical development ecosystem. Lastly, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought forward a merging of the technology and biotechnology revolutions in ways and on a scale we have not previously witnessed. Assessing how the deployment of modern technology can improve education, recruitment, enrollment, informed consent, and participation will be critical to building an improved path forward. We must also assess what hurdles remain and think about how utilization of technology may provide long-term solutions. At BIO, we're presently talking to companies and organizations that specialize in data capture, analysis, and AI learning that could enable greater diversity, participation, provide better ways to educate and inform providers and patients about opportunities to participate in trials, and help us better understand health outcomes across underrepresented communities. This is a multifactorial issue. However, as stated, the current tragedy of the pandemic illustrates not only the necessity, but is also providing an opportunity to learn and implement real and long-lasting change. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, our CEO, Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, has outlined an agenda that is calling on BIO and its members to engage in action that effectuates real change. If anyone participating in this meeting has information or activities we should be aware of, or if you're looking for a collaborative partner, please reach out to me at any time. We stand ready to learn and to work together to implement policies and actions that will change this paradigm and improve clinical trial diversity moving forward. So thank you again very much for the opportunity to participate in this very important discussion.
Thank you very much, Carter. Now we're going to move to our question and answer period. As part of this roundtable discussion, I'd like to direct a question to one of our participants, but of course, if the other one wishes to add in, please do so. The first question I have is for Dr. Garnett. What is Lilly doing to encourage physicians of color to become clinical trial investigators?
Thank you. And as you know, we've helped sponsor the Impact initiative with the NMA, and very proud of that work. But we have had a number of outreach initiatives to physicians of color from all communities, in fact, to really explain the value of clinical trials. And I think it's not just a matter of asking a physician if they want to be an investigator. I think you have to start a little further back than that and explain what the value of clinical trials are. And there's a lot of misunderstanding and I think lack of appreciation of why clinical trials are done and why we need to study heterogeneous communities in our clinical trials. So I think that's a starting point. And I don't think this is an issue that Lilly alone can solve. We've sponsored a number of individual efforts, but I think this is something that as an industry, we need to focus on our outreach. We have a habit as a company and as an industry to go back to the same investigators over and over again, and are sometimes reluctant to reach out to new investigators and encourage new investigators to step forward. And I think we need to change that mindset so that we are accessing new communities in different parts of the country as well. So I think this requires an effort across the organization. You know, the challenge we have, to be honest, is that we want our studies to be recruited very quickly. And sometimes there's a reluctance to go to new investigators because we want to stick with those who are tried and trusted. So I think there's internal communication that needs to be done. And that's why I think measuring and setting targets is important for us, not just for clinical, for patients with clinical trials, but we've now set internal targets for investigators in clinical trials and advisors to the company as well. And those targets will make sure that we do, across all of our therapeutic areas, really drive the participation, because if we're not setting targets internally, we know from past experience that that won't happen. So there's a multiplicity of efforts, but I think we need to recognize no one company or no one approach is going to be exclusively successful.
Thank you. And certainly, I think I've heard in both of the presentations how important it is for collaboration. And so you're again pointing out that. Carter, I would like to ask, you mentioned some of the hurdles for participating in clinical trials. What are some of the biggest hurdles to improvement in the biotechnology area?
So I think, and again, you know, Dr. Garnett may have some additional insights to my comments, but I think historically what we've heard, again, is that exclusion criteria, you know, has been at times a barrier. And so I think, again, we're really learning in this period of COVID of maybe how to rethink that exclusion criteria in different ways. The second thing is, as Dr. Garnett mentioned, is it's really where are the clinical trial sites happening and who is informed about those opportunities, and that I think has a big impact on recruitment. So there's a couple of different things happening, I think, simultaneously under COVID, but also we're also previously existing through the technology revolution. And so as we're seeing deployment of decentralized trial approaches, that opens up new ways to approach geographic diversity, which could improve outreach both at a physician level and a patient level. I think we're also seeing data analysis that can be deployed in the planning stages that could help companies really develop at the very beginning internal strategies and operations at the earliest stages, which could also set them on a better path to success to meet those goals that Dr. Garnett says companies like Lilly, are establishing. And I can't agree more than what Dr. Garnett said is we have to, as an industry, be establishing metrics of success. Ultimately, that's what's going to drive everything, but we can't do it alone. We need to understand from the physician's point of view, from the trialist's point of view, from the patient's point of view, from the community's point of view, what it is that they need, what is it they want to understand, and how can we facilitate participation.
Maybe I'll add a comment there. You know, I think we have a lot of really smart scientists and physicians at Lilly and in other companies, and we're really good at writing clinical trial protocols, but my goodness, we make them complex. And the trouble with having a lot of smart people is you make those protocols more and more complex, and you make them more challenging for people to participate in. You know, we had we set up a lab here at Lilly, which does a dry run of the protocol. So we invite physicians in to help us go through what they would have to do on that first visit or the second visit of the protocol. And some of these visits can take 8 hours for a patient to go through. So we create these incredible barriers in the name of science, and undoubtedly scientifically valid, but they make it really difficult for people, particularly if they're working, to give up time to participate in a study. One of the things we've learned from COVID, and I think it's a great lesson, and it's one that we all need to retain, is this sort of essentialist approach. The industry has moved in 6 months with many of these clinical trials that are running for vaccines and antibodies and treatments. We've done more in 6 months. We've done in 6 months what it would normally take 6 years to do. And while we don't have that vaccine yet, it won't be long before we do, I'm sure. But I think we've learned lessons there that maybe we don't need all of that complexity. Maybe we can focus on essentialism and only include the things in the clinical trials that we absolutely need in order to answer the questions. And I think if we do that, we make our studies easier to participate in and easier for patients to manage. easier for physicians to manage in their clinics as well, because they take time out of their clinics. So I think one of the lessons I hope that we retain after the COVID pandemic passes is a new approach to a more essentialist clinical trial design that doesn't put in so many barriers and burdens for the patients and the investigators.
Thank you. And that sort of leads me into another question in reference to when you have those healthcare providers who serve in communities of color and they really want to encourage their patients to enroll. We've heard about some of the barriers that are there and how you can relax them. So where should they actually start? I think it's important in terms of the transparencies, and as you spoke about the COVID-19 and the vaccine trials, and it seems like we're really kind of rushing this through. Are we communicating with the communities of color and letting them know where we are along the way so that you didn't isolate something in isolation from them and now you want to try them and they will look at this as, I don't want to be a guinea pig again. So how do you then start this conversation with those providers in the community and getting those patients involved when they should know about it at each step along the way?
Well, I think in this respect, COVID is a great opportunity, but also creates something of a challenge, because the opportunity is that everyone knows why we need to do clinical trials on COVID. We don't need to explain that to people. The clear need to our community across the nation, across the world is obvious. And there's been a lot of media coverage, most of it balanced, that really has explained a lot about clinical trials that maybe we've challenged ourselves to explain in the past and why we need to do them. So that's the plus point. I think the challenge is that we need to make sure that as we go into African American communities, into Latino communities, that they don't feel we're taking advantage of them, that we're going there, well, now we need the patients, so we'll come into this community. And in that sense, we've worked with church groups and other community groups in the areas where we focused, as I mentioned, Detroit, Houston, and others, to explain why we're doing the clinical trials so that we don't go down a pathway where people feel they're being exploited as a source of patients, as opposed to we're acknowledging the need to recruit patients from that community. So I think in that respect, COVID has helped us, but we also need to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past so that those communities feel they're being taken advantage of, and that we're only going there now because, well, we really need patients. So we'll go to the African American communities now because we really need you, but otherwise we don't. And of course, that has to be matched with provision of care afterwards. We need to make sure that the vaccines and the antibodies and the other treatments are available for people, regardless of their social status or their access to healthcare. And I think that's been a very clear commitment from the pharmaceutical industry that everyone needs to be able to take advantage of these vaccines once they're available. They can't then be means tested or tested are only provided to those who can afford them. That I think would be in a way a repetition of our mistakes of the past.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Esham, you spoke about the clinical development enterprise and the point of care. So what do you see as the biggest opportunity for improvement?
Sure, and if I may, I just want to add an additional comment to the previous question and throw out maybe a request, and that is, as a trade association, that represents, hundreds of biotech companies, we are actively working with partners, again, such as the National Black Church Initiative and others, to try to ensure that we're collecting all of the educational materials that are being developed by either companies or other scientific, academic, medical, professional organizations. We're reviewing those, and if we deem them valid and useful, we can be a conduit of providing information. So we will be doing that on our website. But if people watching this meeting want access to that or have information they want us to be posting and sharing, please let us do that. But we can also support others' efforts by providing them with all of these kinds of educational tools that will, again, our desire is to make sure that people understand the science, understand what the data is actually telling you, providing you with information about access, again, all to ensure that people have confidence when these products become available, confidence that they will be beneficial to them, but that they will understand exactly what the data readouts were at the time of approval. So in terms of the second question, what can we do in regards to, and again, hopefully I'm getting this question right, in regards to looking at the point of care. Is that correct, Dr. Brown?
Yes, you talked about
Yeah.
the enterprise at point of care, and so what kinds of opportunities do we see there for improvement?
Well, so this is, and again, Dr. Garnett mentioned a couple of things, but I think for us, I will still admit to wanting to have really open ears here and really hearing from the physicians themselves. I think we've already talked about some of the geographical limitations which may have created inadvertent barriers to access. But again, I think we're trying to really get a handle on a comprehensive label, how well informed are physicians, particularly those that serve underrepresented communities. How are they informed generally about clinical trials and the value, but also the specific opportunities as they come up? And as you think about, again, technology, are the ways we can look at platforms to make it easier to sort of have consistent information about those opportunities and points of contact? How can we create these conduits between the key stakeholders? So that's something as a trade association we're thinking about, is sort of looking across the ecosystem and trying to figure out are there bridges there that we can build that might be beneficial? But there also may be policy, like real policy barriers or operational practices that we have to rethink. And I think that's where we're trying to learn lessons from COVID, but also just having general open ears to hear from those communities, and so that we can effectuate change.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time, but I have one other question that I hope both of you will answer. We know that the census is projecting that by the next 20 years, 25 years, the minority population will be primarily white. What can be done now to ensure that when we get to 2040, 2045, you have created an equitable, innovative treatment strategy that will improve the overall health outcome for all demographics?
Well,
a loaded question, but
it is. I sincerely hope in 2045 we're not still having to have this conversation. That's the first thing I would say. But actually, I do feel optimistic. If I look at how the trajectory is going to increase minority representation as investigators, if I look at how it's going to, how our numbers are improving in clinical trial recruitment, but also within our own company. I mean, I think one of the keys here is that one way to address this is to make sure that our own organizations are diverse and that we have people from diverse backgrounds who are in leadership positions in the organization. And I think if we can do that, then I think this will become a non-issue with time. But I also hope that we don't look back in 20 years and look at COVID and say we wasted an opportunity. Because I really do think, you've got this is a disastrous pandemic, but good things will come out of it. Good things will come out of it in terms of the speed with which we develop drugs in the future. Good things will come out of it in terms of how we run our clinical trials and become less dependent on the traditional visit to the investigator. And I hope that one of the things that comes out of it is really a final push that makes us ensure that appropriate representation in our clinical trials is something that we all take as just standard and something we do. And if we're running a trial in the US and we're not got the right representation of a given minority, we should keep running that study until we do. We have ways of doing that. We do that in other parts of the world when we need to recruit Chinese or other patients into studies. We can do that in the US as well. So I think the time is right to really make a change that is sustainable and will be consistent across the whole industry.
Yeah, I'll concur with Dr. Garnett, and I would say a metric of success would definitely not be having this conversation well before 2045. That is a definitive metric of success at minimum. And again, he really highlighted all of the key important things. But what I would say is reflective of my comments is on the education and dissemination of information, not just generally, but about specific opportunities. We really got to quit thinking of working in silos and really build these sort of collaborative, seamless ability to communicate to those that need this information, be it the physicians or the patients. Again, as Dr. Garnett said, I think really looking at it, the companies are looking at this from an operational basis, and that's key. It's not just saying we want to do this. It's like really internally building strategies, dedicated personnel, dedicated time on how they approach clinical trial development. That's going to make a huge difference. And then 3, again, I do think cannot underestimate the potential that the technology revolution can bring to this. And we're seeing that in real time during this COVID pandemic. And I think that's something we want to take a really close assessment on, and what worked well, where the hurdles still lie. And I'm very optimistic we can overcome them, again, on an operational basis. So I too share Dr. Garnett's enthusiasm and optimism. But I will also underscore, we have open ears. We need to learn quickly, and we need to work collaboratively.
Thank you so much. Again, is there an important one statement as we are winding down, a take-home point that you would like to add that the listeners could hone in before I give sort of a summation here of the importance of really participating in clinical trials? So what's your one take-home point?
Well, I don't know if I can get it down to one point, but I'll try. Firstly, we don't know everything. So as mentioned before, if there are people who have ideas and thoughts and suggestions on how we can really move the needle on this, we're very open to hearing those things. And secondly, we can do this if we collaborate. If the pharmaceutical companies, organizations like the NMA, the FDA, pharma and bio, if we work together, we can really make a difference here. And the door has never been more open than it is now for us to really make this a sustained and meaningful difference.
So I will just say ditto to everything that my colleague Dr. Garnett said. But to one point, I mean, the importance of participation in clinical trials is important in understanding the overall health of communities. And so again, this data goes beyond the application for a specific drug. It provides us with information about how to better treat patients of all genders, races, ethnicities, and ages. So again, it's part of that creating health equity, generally speaking.
Thank you so very much. And I'll just add my comment. I certainly agree with what both of you have said. The one caveat that I would add to this fact is that we've been talking about health disparities for at least 20 years, and the needle has only moved a little bit. I think because of COVID, as one of the positive things that may come out of this is that whether it is related to the Black Lives Movement that has occurred, that it now moves it to the forefront, and we're really ready to take action. It's there. And so while the National Medical Association has been speaking about achieving health equity, and it's not one size that fits all, you have to be creative and innovative and do things in ways that we haven't done before. And because of COVID, we are going to be forced to do things in ways that we haven't done before. We have to use telemedicine. We have to have a pharmacist giving out some health information, because that may be the point of education and information for certain communities. And so as we look at moving forward for the next 20, 25 years, we really have to do a true collaboration and be active oriented. And I think we can achieve that because the National Medical Association is going to remain trusted resource in the community and the collective voice for African American physicians and the leading force for parity and justice in medicine in the future. And it is important for participants to know that as a consumer, as a patient, you need to know what you need to know in order to participate in those clinical trials. And you should get that information from your resource, your trusted resource in the community, because it's really up to the participants and they have the power. We need to make sure that they understand they have the power to make a difference in medicine today and into the future. And they can join us in becoming agents of change, so they should enroll in a clinical trial. I want to thank my panelists. I want to thank Senator Menendez and our listeners out there in the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation legislative period for listening in and being a part of this. Thank you.